welcome back to the final episode of Movie Star Magic. And this final episode, I'm going to be talking about Steve Martin, a guy I've been wanting to talk about really since the beginning of the series, but decided to do it right at the end here. Just at the top, I want to say you guys have been showing a lot of support for the series. I know my sort of Oscar stuff is the more popular stuff later on in the year. Don't worry, we're going to get back to that next week. Best picture predictions, all that stuff. That's my bread and butter, but I still really enjoy doing these sort of film analysis type series throughout the summer, and I really did sort of learn a lot, I think, in terms of understanding that movie star and what that is, and how they bring stuff to films by going through a lot of the different actors' movies. So if you haven't seen the series, you're just coming back now for the Oscar stuff, welcome, but please feel free to go back and see some other actors and their stuff and what they've been doing, and just to see how we sort of evolve the series throughout the summer and go back and pick some of your favorite actors. We've done a whole bunch and have had a blast doing it, but also for the people that have been just watching the Movie Star Magic stuff, please do stick around for my Oscars content. It's a fun ride where we predict the Oscars starting here in October all the way into March this year. The ups and downs. The Golden Globes are back this year. I think it's going to be a really fun race, and I'm excited to do that. But jumping into this episode, if you still are new to the series, what I do and have been doing every single week is picking an actor and trying to find what their movie star magic is. Essentially, the first 2/3 of the video is breaking down their career into 3 separate chapters and talking about a movie in each of those chapters, just so you get an understanding of what their overall career arc ultimately was. And then finally, in the sort of last third of the video, trying to figure out what is that sort of significant descriptor that I can give to them that makes them such a unique movie star. What is that one thing that makes them so unique as a movie star that they have, that no one else has, that they've had really throughout their entire career? But jumping into things, starting off with chapter 1, I'm calling this chapter the Meta Man. And to understand Steve Martin as a movie star, you have to understand him first as a comedic star, because in the 70s, Steve Martin was a huge stand-up comedian, and in many ways became a movie star because he'd sort of mastered that craft, in which he had these big stadiums with people, and they were just laughing at anything he did, so therefore he sort of felt it was a little bit too easy, and then decided to go into the movie side. But he was a guy that was a huge stand-up first on all late night shows, and of course his own stand-up shows that he put on, and his brand of comedy was very much silly. So to understand the sort of early stand-up comedian period, you have to understand the movie star period, because in many ways it's an extension of that. Because he was a well-known movie star, a well-known stand-up comedian, when he became a movie star, really in 1979 as The Jerk, which is sort of his first big-time starring leading role. That sort of brand of comedy that he's had for the first, I'd say, 10 or so years of his career is very much linked back to his stand-up comedy persona. And it's still sort of a persona of his humor in himself, but early on, I think, in this period, it was defined as a movie star what his style of comedy was, and that was silly. I mean, you have certain people like Jonah Hill or Seth Rogen, sort of known for more of the raunchier kind of comedies. Will Ferrell, more absurdist. You could say Bill Murray, kind of the sarcasm. So each comedian has their own sort of style, and I would sort of consider Steve Martin always sort of silly and goofy. But particularly in this early period, it always has to do with a certain level of meta-ness. The Jerk is sort of his big breakout role, is a huge success, but it's very much sort of commenting on film structures and what you think is going to happen, a bunch of sort of setup and payoffs and subverting expectations, and then sort of leans very much into that. Imagine Steve Martin in a film noir, so it's a sort of a parody of that in Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, and then he does a lot of the Carl Reiner stuff, 4 more Carl Reiner movies after The Jerk, so continues in that sort of vein of the parody kind of style. Pennies from Heaven is another example of where it's like, hey, what if we made a movie about the Depression era that was realistic, but then occasionally had these sort of bright, bubbly 30s era Depression era upbeat songs to it, and sort of contrast that there? Or what can we do with the sort of the silly premises of All of Me and The Lonely Guy? There's this sort of period of stretches where The Jerk is a really big hit and is a huge box office success, so that instantly makes him a movie star to bank on. And then his comedy's become a little bit more eccentric, a little bit more weird. Pennies from Heaven is a strange movie. Even something like All of Me is a little bit odd. It's high concept, but kind of strange in its execution, and for the most part, some of them bomb and some of them make some money, but never like a huge success like The Jerk. So he's still sort of carrying along, but it's always that sort of silliness in a meta element, commenting on some other sort of medium of film, or on a really sort of high concept premise, a man who falls in love with a brain, certain things like that really define, I think, his early period. But then picking a defining role for this period, ultimately I did go with The Jerk, because that's one of my favorite comedies of all time. And for me, older comedies don't always work. I do think that there's sort of a period from, say, 11, 12 to 18 years old where you really start to define your humor, and therefore you attach oftentimes to the movies that came out during that period. So for me, Anchorman and Superbad, and then all the way into This Is the End. There are certain movies where I just really connect with in terms of, oh, that's my humor, that's the kind of stuff I like. So as a result, I'm a big, Jonah Hill fan and Will Ferrell and Seth Rogen, that sort of generation. But then when I went back and watched certain eras, like Ghostbusters or even Three Amigos, sometimes they don't always work with me. And that's okay, because I think comedies are very sort of generational, and you sort of have your guy that you really like. But what was surprised when I went back and watched The Jerk is that it sort of transcended that. It was just a great movie in and of itself. It reminded me of Airplane in many ways, because it's very much just so committed to the setup, payoff, how many jokes can we fit in this, how many gags can we get in here, just jam-packed and full of funny stuff. And it's both, I think, visually comedic, but also smartly written. Sort of that just setup, payoff, and subverting those expectations. These things, something's going to happen, and then something doesn't. And then Steve Martin as a performer is just so great in this movie because of how committed he is to this premise, and he totally understands it and executes it perfectly. It's a great sort of early extension of that sort of stand-up comedic career that he had, that I still do think is also very funny. So he's a performer that I think, and his films particularly hold up when rewatching them. Not all of them were sort of slam dunks for me, but the ones that hit something like The Jerk are definitely worth watching and definitely worth reviewing. But then into the second chapter, I'm calling this chapter The Dad, because after The Jerk he had the big success there, and then a couple of sort of smaller medium successes, but a couple of bombs. He wasn't necessarily the heights of The Jerk yet, but in '87 I think he really transformed from just being the sort of meta commentary, satire, parody kind of guy into a real serious kind of dramatic comedy, dramatic kind of a leading man. In '87 he has Roxanne and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, both movies which do well at the box office, that are critically acclaimed and show a different side of Steve Martin. He's actually sort of playing a real life character and a real life kind of a guy. And he's now in his 40s. He's really rocking that sort of white hair, where he had it before, but it was kind of weird and odd that he had it. It was a strange thing about him. Now it's like, oh no, he's 40, he has white hair, a little bit earlier than most people, but he's kind of the dad. He's mature, he sort of grew into that. And then after that sort of '87 year, we get significantly more, I think, dramatic roles with something like Grand Canyon in '91, or even Parenthood or Father of the Bride, where he's very much playing, a real guy that maybe really has maybe sometimes funny parts, but for the most part is kind of essentially dramatic in its nature. So then when choosing a defining role for this period in this chapter that he feels like a real person, I wanted to go with sort of a dad performance, because I always think of Steve Martin, I do think of like a dad, because oftentimes he is playing that, and always still a movie that has some of the dramatic elements he shows he can evolve, but still some of the sort of the goofy wackiness. So ultimately I went with The Father of the Bride, which I think is the peak of the sort of Charles Shire Myers collaboration. Now we talked a bit about the Nancy Myers particularly last week with Diane Keaton, so I don't want to go too much into their sort of collaboration and their kind of brand, but really more so Martin and what he brings to this film. And what he does, I think, is give us a strong understanding of who this guy is, because he ultimately, and is so great at playing real people that feel like sort of regular guys, but feel like they're always trying to do the right thing, that the character motivations aren't sort of slimy and weird. Like if you think of something like a Harrison Ford or a Kurt Russell, guys we've covered in the past, they're classic heroes, right? But they're heroes and sometimes in a slimy kind of sense. They'll do something bad, they'll be sarcastic, but at the end of the day, they'll do the right thing. They'll make a couple of mistakes, but because they're so charismatic, we'll sort of allow that to happen before they actually make the big thing. Steve Martin has charisma, but is very much closer to something like a Tom Hanks, where his intentions are always pure, his understandings are always clear, he's never trying to sort of cheat away in a certain sense, he's always trying to do the actual correct thing, just hijinks and things and situations get in the way. So when we see his sort of reaction to his daughter getting married, which is kind of absurd that he'd have that kind of extreme reaction, but we still understand it because Steve Martin as a performer is really clear at making it clear to us that he still sees this as a little girl and wants her to be safe and still sees her as young. So there's a sympathy on our side just because we understand his character motivation so clearly, which I think the film does so great at. But then, of course, let's not forget, there is some still wacky funness, with Martin Short's character and some of the reactions that he has there. He still allows him to be silly and goofy, but now more of a dad and more in a real kind of a movie where you can have real dramatic stakes. And Steve Martin, it really shows that he can do that as well. Then chapter 3, I'm calling the Snowbird, because he's gone from the sort of dad period into the grandfather period, the retiree period. I'd say, his last chapters from like 87 to 99, Bowfinger sort of the last of that period in my opinion, because of course we go into a new century, but also he's starting to write less of his movies. Before he was writing a lot of his movies, LA Story, he starts to write a novel in I think 2000, 2001, so he starts to focus more on the novel side versus say writing stuff for himself. And Bowfinger was sort of like the last film that he wrote that he starred in him as a comedic persona. And I say it's a Snowbird period because I think the sort of last 20 years of his career have been made up, I think, kind of unfortunately, of retiree kind of movies, which is how I would describe them, which are movies that are unoffensive, slightly funny, and generally sometimes kind of forgettable. And also I call it the Snowbird period because it's not only Steve Martin's classic white hair that he has that makes him feel old, it's the posters. It's crazy when I was looking at the 10 past years of really 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, thereabouts, you get 8 movies with white posters. So 10-year period, 8 movies with white posters. It's literally just Steve Martin and text. Steve Martin, Cheaper by the Dozen. Steve Martin, Queen Latifah, Bringing Down the House. Baby Mama. So both Cheaper by the Dozens. Baby Mama, Bringing Down the House. Both Pink Panthers. It's Complicated. Another sort of Nancy Meyers movie that he does. All these sort of him on a white poster, and that's kind of the movie. And it goes away from like, oh, this is an interesting concept and Steve Martin's in this interesting movie. It's more so now like Steve Martin, he's got a bunch of kids, and that's the movie. And it's a little bit unfortunate because I do think he has a really great run there. Even early on with The Jerk and Dip and Don't Wear Plaid, it was kind of an underrated period. And then his sort of classic period of Plane, Trains, Automobiles and Parenthood and Father of the Bride, even up to Bowfinger. He's sort of consistently, I think, a really talented comedic actor. And then in sort of this sort of 10-year period there, he starts to fall off a bit, where he doesn't have as many sort of classic successes. I mean, Shop Girl was another sort of white poster kind of a movie. Maybe it was just the era of the time, but he definitely seemed to predominate in that area. But that's how I would sort of describe this period of a retiree period, because he's playing older, but also his movies become a little bit less offensive, a little bit more safe, a little bit more traditional, and the quality I do think dips a bit. But that being said, he's got Murders in the Building now, and he's had sort of a bit of a resurgence there, working with Martin Short and that sort of later period collaboration. So I think he'll still be remembered highly. I haven't seen that movie, but still in terms of, this is Movie Star, so we're talking about the movie output. But I do want to mention, Only Murders in the Building has been successful for him, and he'll sort of ride that off, I think, until the end. But when picking my defining role for this period, ultimately I went with Cheaper by the Dozen, just because I still feel a lot of nostalgic feelings for it when I saw it when I was younger, but also because I think the movie itself, while maybe it's not actually the best Steve Martin movie, is a movie that totally understands its tone. This is a movie that is all about kids and kids wrecking havoc, and it's a total sort of kids fantasy kind of movie, and that's the way I see it. In the same way Home Alone is kind of a kids fantasy movie where they can have all these brothers and sisters and do the hijinks and take over the house and play hockey in the house and do all crazy experiments and whatnot, and kind of mess with some of the older siblings' boyfriend, Ashton Kutcher and things like that. And it's very much almost an extension to like a Buster Keaton movie. Very sort of physically funny, very sort of gag driven. And I think Martin and I do have to give him credit for being willing to go into this movie that is family friendly and very much kid oriented, but still be that focus of the dad and still kind of have a fun attitude toward it. He does feel kind of like the fun dad, even though he's sort of stretched into these different ways. So when talking about the defining feature now of Steve Martin, when I think of Steve Martin, it's the silly hero, because when I think of Steve Martin, I always think of silly. That's why I've always thought silly, goofy kind of a humor, where in the early days, it's sort of a meta silliness, and later on, when he's a dad, it's kind of like the goofy silliness, the wacky silliness, but he's always sort of silly. And that's sort of his comedic style. But then he's always the hero. He's not always a side character. He's not sort of a character actor, which he could have been. He's very much the hero because I think in a certain regard, he has this kind of, like I said, Tom Hanks-esque, Tom Hanks-esque, or how would I call it? I would say he excels particularly well in terms of playing real life people, in terms of people that are relatable. Not necessarily in a charismatic, funny place like, I want to be friends with this guy, but more like oh, that seems like my next door neighbor. You know, when his job is always sort of nameless. He's a football coach, he's an advertising executive, he's a lawyer. It doesn't really matter what his job is. The job is just there to put him in a way of trying to achieve his goals, of being a better dad, of getting back home for Thanksgiving, or whatever it is. He is a great guy whose intentions are clear, his intentions are pure. He always seems like there's a safeness and a reliability. So when I think of a Steve Martin movie, the hijinks comes from sort of the situations that stop him from getting to his ultimate goal, but that ultimate goal always ends up happening. It's always a happy ending. And I do think that in all of his films, there is a sense of low stakes, kind of a warmth, of a safety with the Steve Martin movie, that there's never really a big seriousness in even something like Three Amigos. You know they're going to get at the end of the day, because it's silly, it's fun, it's lighthearted, nothing seems itself true dramatic. We'll get through at the end of it, and there is this sort of balanced optimism that he brings, that he's always playing this guy who has this optimism, who seems like a good-hearted guy, but then, you know, is getting crushed down by the world and everything around him. But he always seems to be sort of this pure, great guy. So then, by extent, when you're watching a Steve Martin movie, I think a lot of those sort of values hold true to the movie. So if you want to watch a movie that's a great movie for, you know, Sunday afternoon, that's sometimes inoffensive, but is, you know, make you funny, and you don't have to think too much always, and you know it's going to end in a happy ending, there's a comfort to that. I think Steve Martin has totally excelled in that kind of a comfort genre, where it's always interesting, it's always fascinating, it's always funny, but it's never sort of, you never really feel the stakes. You know, even something like Mixed Nuts, which is a lesser sort of film of his, it is a movie that it has that same sort of Steve Martin energy, where you never really think something bad is going to happen. It will resolve itself in the end, and it does. So if you're looking for funny, silly, humorous stuff that's good for sort of the whole family, PG-13, pop in a Steve Martin movie. I've always wanted to cover him because he's got this great career of this specific genre and type of movie that is a Steve Martin movie, and that's kind of what the series is all about. What does the actor bring to their career, and what kind of movies do they make? Sometimes they lend themselves to great directors, and sometimes they sort of form their own identity in their own kind of movie, and I think Steve Martin definitely did that. But that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below for your favorite Steve Martin movies, and next week, stay tuned. Best Picture predictions for the 2023 Oscars. They'll be out. Can't wait. Hope to see you there. And until next time, stay tuned.